Bum 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 bum.
Tomatoes?
Hello, and welcome to the video for How Do I Do Basic Collision. Let me run through a quick little example that we'll be using to discuss collision. When I run this, a few different things happen. We had a cube fall through the floor here, but I am not falling through the floor. We've got a few cubes here that I can move. We've got a cube that I cannot move, but I collide with, and then we have a sphere that I managed to go through. So let's go ahead, and we also get an error, but that error is actually important. So let's discuss collision in general. Basically, collision with Unreal Engine 4 is designed to either ignore, overlap, or block. And based on one of those three settings, you're either going to pass your collision when two things hit, or you're going to ignore each other. They're going to not block, but overlap, and that's going to generate an overlap event that you can do something with. Or they're going to block and prevent one thing from going through the other. Now, almost everything inside of the engine can have collision if it's of the type that can accept collision. And most things can have collision. It's usually going to be your static meshes. And it's going to be like your collision volumes. Invisible meshes basically designed to block, ignore, overlap. Now I'm using my character. And by default, the character is of type pawn. That is the object type. And it is set to collide with other things that are set to block the pawn. Now you have these static meshes here, which I've simply dropped into my scene. And these are going to be, let's actually just delete this one and drag a new cube. I am skipping a few things on purpose just to cover them in general, and then we'll go into specifics. But we have this cube here, for example, and if I was to simulate, it's just going to sit there and do nothing. If I was to run, it's going to block me. So even though it's doing nothing, it's still blocking me. And that's because of the way its collision is set up. Now when I say the collision is set up, we've got a few different things. In any item that has collision, you'll find the collision dropdown. And there's a few different things. We're not going to cover the advanced section down here. These are things that are for more advanced requirements, such as you have a fast-moving projectile and you want to make sure it's going to not go through a thin object. Or you want to make sure that when something is going through something else, it's going to properly track. But we're going to ignore these. We're not going to cover them in the basics. Our collisions have a few presets. We have whether or not they generate a hit event when we're simulating. The type of physical material. Now this is more for physics and not necessarily for collision. Technically, physics are required for collisions. However, you don't necessarily have to have physics on in order to use collisions. So it's a catch-22. Generate overlap events, whether we're going to use an overlap or not. And then the two most important things in here are, can the character step up on, and collision presets. Let's ignore the can character step on. This is basically whether they're going to walk up onto it like a slope when they bump into it rather than just being stopped. Let's just go ahead and ignore that. Collision presets is the most important thing about collisions. It determines what happens when two things interact. Now, collision presets are presets. They're a set of rules that come built in with the engine or rules you can add. They are not perfect, and they are just words. Even though, for example, this one says block all, I have a custom channel set to overlap and a custom channel set to ignore. So even though this says block all, I've done a few different things and it doesn't block all. So you need to keep that in mind. The collision presets are just presets. Once you start messing with them, and you can mess with every single one, these names are just there to help you out. And they're also what things come from by default. When you create a pawn, you'll have the pawn preset. When you create something like this block here, it's going to be set up as a block all. If you create something like a collision volume, it's going to be a different type, etc., etc. So I was mentioning we have presets. Well, how do we get to those and how do we use them? Inside of your project settings, you'll find a collision setting box, tab, section. Let's go with section. Inside of here, you have 3 different sections inside of our section. Here are our presets. These are all the presets that come built in with the engine, and you have the ability to add your own preset. They're basically designed to work how the engine expects things to work. So, for example, here's block all. It's set to have query and physics turned on, and the type is world static. The intention of this is, for example, a floor or a wall. It's intended to block everything. Then you have something like block all dynamic. This is intended to block everything, but this is a dynamic item. It's not a static item. It's not meant to be a wall. Maybe it's a projectile, or maybe it's a box that you can push around in your scene. It's meant to block everything that hits it, but it's also meant to move in the world. Then you have things like your pawns, which are of type pawn. It's meant to collide with everything. You have like your spectator camera, which is a pawn, but it's meant to be query only. It's not meant to be blocked by everything. Your spectator camera is meant to go around the world. And it continues down. Invisible wall, triggers, UI, things like that. Now, the collision type and the object type are what determines at the basic level what is going to happen and if it's going to happen to something. Now I need to show you an example on what I mean by this. We have this item here. It's just simply a cube that I brought in that has some default settings. Now the default settings are block all, collision enabled for query and physics, and the object type is world static. Now the object type here refers to the object type for collision purposes of the object this is on. So the floor is considered a world static item. This cube is considered a world static item. This cube over here, which is actually part of a blueprint, if I click on it, it's considered a physics body, object type physics body. If I click on our box, it's considered, if we pull it up, world dynamic. So the object type is very important. When you're setting up collision, the object type is what's going to determine what happens. So this is what I mean. I have this set up as a world static. Let's pull up my character and we'll go to the capsule component. This is what's outside my character and determines my collision. It is set to pawn. Now, if my pawn walks into this cube, we're going to have an interaction between a pawn and a world static. So if we look, we'll see what happens. This world static item is set to block the block column pawns. Pull up my character. This pawn object type is set to have block with world static. So when we run this, the collision, let's turn on show collision. This collider that is around my character is blocked by the cube because they are both set to block each other. That's what counts. Right now my pawn is basically pushing into the cube. It's going to say, hey cube, what are we going to do when we touch? The cube is going to look at itself and go, well, let's see, you are a pawn, so we are going to block you. And that's it. It's as simple as that. I can show you exactly what I mean. Let's go into here to block all, and let's change this to custom. Custom just lets me make any changes to any of these sections. Let's go to pawn, and let's go to ignore. And let's go ahead and hit play. Let's go over here to the cube, and you'll notice we now walk through. Now you're seeing my camera clipping because it's set to block the camera channel, but the actual cube itself will not block my pawn because it's set to ignore it. Now to fix the camera, for example, that would be one of these up here. Maybe I'd want to go up to these two and ignore them. Let's hit play. We'll walk through. And you'll know now it goes through. What's happening there is, if I go into my character, let's go into my spring arm, or my camera, but the spring arm's the appropriate thing. And we have an option here called probe channel, camera. Basically what this is doing is the camera is looking at the camera channel, and if it collides with something, so when right here, when we walk into it, it's going to go ahead and treat it as a collision. If we go back into here and we look at our thing, and we go to camera, it's set to ignore. So our camera, as it goes through this cube, will not trigger a collision, therefore nothing's going to happen. If we set it back to block, and we hit play, you'll notice the minute we go in there, our camera is now blocking the camera channel, and we zoom in. The intent of that is for when you're doing stuff like this, you turn around a wall, and you notice how the camera zooms in. That's what that's for. If we go ahead and shut that off again, and we hit play, now you notice it will not block. That is a collision channel. We have the two different types. We have an object channel and a trace channel. So far we've just dealt with the object channel. And your object channel for the most part is going to be used for physical interaction. My pawn against this block. My pawn object channel against the block's world static channel. That's why we set it back to here and we hit play, and bam, we get blocked. If we go back to pawn and set it to overlap and we hit play, I'm still going to be able to walk through it. But this cube, it has an overlap event built into it. It will now trigger. Blocking is physical. Overlapping is triggerable. Basically, I walked into fire. Now let's catch me on fire and do damage. And ignore is, I have no clue what's going on. I know nothing. So that's going to cover the object channels. The trace channels are pretty much the same. Blocking, overlapping, and ignore. But there's no physical response. They're just meant to be used for triggering something. For example, first-person shooter, I fire a line trace. It shoots forward. Anything that is set to block, usually the visibility channel on a line trace, will trigger a hit, and it's going to block it. But as you saw, we used our camera channel for blocking, so that way when the spring arm, this red line here, when this spring arm is blocked by something in the camera, when we turn this, our camera, as you notice, is now blocked. It's going to jump forward automatically as part of the code, so that way it's not being obstructed. And we can always see, no matter what we're trying to do. Now you notice here, it's being blocked, but you'll find something like this sphere does not, because it's set to ignore. And of course this one's going to block as well. And the funny part is there's actually a collision volume right here. Well, you can't see it actually, it fell down. I just remembered. So that is the trace set of channels. Now inside of here we have our object and trace channels. This is our edit project settings. Before we covered the presets. Now we have our custom channels. These are, you have access to 18 of them. 18 object and 18... Actually, you can have up to 18 custom channels including object and trace. Well, you have 18. I don't know if it's 18 and 18 or 18 total. I've never used more than a couple. So let's just assume 18 total. Basically, these are custom channels that you can use to either check against collision on an object, physical collision, physical interaction, or the metaphysical interaction with a trace. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've made a custom object channel. You just hit new channel, it'll ask you for some information, and the default. The default is important. If we go into our block all, this is something, actually, we need to, I don't want to delete these. I'll make a new one. let's go into our block all. And you'll notice in our block all, let's go ahead and set that to block everything. So now our block all is kind of like default. It's set to block everything. It's blocking our custom trace channel. It's blocking our custom object channel. And you'll notice as I go through every default, they all have the custom channels. When you create a new channel, so I'll go new object channel and I'll do custom 2. The default response will be what is added to every single one of these as the default response. So for example, if you wanted to make this, let's make one for enemy. And we want the default response to be block. One thing you might want to do is, well, I'm going to create an enemy and I want my player to be blocked by it so that way it's physically interacting. I want my guns when I fire them to be physically blocked by him, and you do something like that. You might not want to do block as your default response because it's going to block a UI. It's going to make the overlap all default to block. It's going to make everything default to block. I'd personally, when you add a new channel, figure out what you want to use it for. This is specifically going to be for tracing against my enemies. I'm going to go ahead and set it to ignore and accept it. Now we have a new channel. And if I go into any of these, like block all, you'll find enemy is set to ignore. Now the nice thing is you can just simply go back in, set your pawn is going to block the enemy. And let's see, we want block all to block the enemy. And we'll do block all to block the enemy. And that might be it. That might be all you want to actually, well, let's do invisible, block the enemy. And then that's it. That's all we're going to set. Everything else will be set to ignore because we never plan on using them with our enemy. It makes no sense for our UI to block the enemy. So that's something to keep in mind. Now the custom channels are great. For example, like I mentioned, we have an enemy for an object type. Maybe I want to only, as an example, you could set up a box that is a collider in a doorway. You can set that to block the enemy type, but not block the player type. And then that way the player can freely go in and out, maybe a home base, but the enemy is not allowed to go in. So you set it up as kind of like your home point, maybe from a multiplayer game. That's an easy way of doing it with the object channels. Doing it with the trace channels is great. You could put projectiles on their own trace channel. You could put the enemy on their own trace channel, for example. That way, when you're firing a bullet, it'll only affect the enemy. It's really easy to filter out. Line traces and such are covered in their own videos, and they'll cover the different channels. But this is how you would go ahead and create your own. So, let's run through our example here and cover some things. We covered the collision settings down here. We covered the presets. Now the other options in here. Let's go ahead and this is set to block all, right? Yeah, I think I changed my character, right? Let's see, character, capsule component, pawn. Is that not? Oh, that's because, wait, let's see. Okay, so this is let's hit play. And let's go over here and let's see what's happening. So this is one of those instances where this is set to a custom channel. There we go. Let's try this again. There we go. Now it's blocked. And our camera should still be blocked again. Okay. So we keep getting this error. What does this error mean? If you're using physics and you're using collision and they're not compatible. For example, I want to simulate my cube dropping down and spinning and gravity affecting it and things pushing it. But I set my collision type to query only, as in metaphysical, as in not physically going to interact with anything. It's going to warn me. In this case, invalid simulate options. The body of the test collision actor box is set to simulate physics, but collision enabled is incompatible. So we need to find collision actor C2 box, which is test collision actor. And it's going to be our cube 2. And, or is it cube 1? Wait, let's see. I can stop doing, or is it my box? There we go, it's my box. I have inside of here a cube, and just a box collision actor. My cube is set to block everything dynamically. This cube is set to block everything dynamically. And then my box is set to overlap all dynamic. Remember, it's meant as a trigger. It's meant more to, I walk into it and I catch on fire type thing. When we are in here, though, I've gone ahead and changed a few things. I've changed my left cube to become a physics actor. My right cube is a physics actor. And then my box itself is set to overlap all. Now, the problem is, and where the, oh, okay, I can see that from behind. The problem is, I've told all three of these things to simulate physics. So when we hit play, you see the two cubes fall and they act naturally. If we were to show collision, well, you're going to notice a problem here. You don't see the box collider that was here. And that's where the error is coming from. I've told it to simulate physics. If we go back to our box, and under physics, I've told it to simulate physics. And gravity's on, so therefore it's going to fall. The problem is, I've also told it it's only set to overlap. If you look here, everything's to overlap or ignore. And the collision enabled is set to query. This body is used only for collision queries. Metaphysical. Raycasts, sweeps, and overlaps. It's not going to physically interact with anything. And due to that, the engine is like, well, you want it to do something in the world, but you're telling it not to interact with anything in the world. So you've done something wrong here. You've done something crazy. Well, if we change this to custom, for example, I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Here's our collisions enabled. We have four options. No collision. We'll turn on no collision. We'll hit play. We'll pull it back out. We have an error. This item right here basically went straight down. Actually, if we turn this on, so collision, yeah, you'll find that it went straight down. I wish I could keep, hold on, let's see. See, I can turn on collisions while we're in here, but it doesn't stay on. Let me have the box selected. Okay. Yeah, darn it. Let's see. Show. Oh, advanced. Showing collisions when it starts is one of those things that I always have a problem finding. And looks like I might not be able to do it. What I've been doing is use the console command for show collisions. But the problem is once the editor starts up, it immediately hides it until I start the, actually, blueprints, open level blueprint. This should work. Execute console command. Show collision. Hopefully I spelled that right. Okay, let's see what happens here, shall we? Is it show collisions? No, show collision. No, wait, it was on. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, so this box is immediately falling through, is what's happening. Actually, I take that back. It's not immediately falling through, it's disappearing because it's not set up to collide. That's right. That's one of those things where you have to keep in mind. So down here I have it set to no collision. We change this to query only and hit play. There we go. That was what I intended to have happen. Let's switch it to simulate and watch what happens. If you'll notice, this cube here will fall through the ground and we'll get this error. That's because we've set this collision box up to query only and it's going to just fall through the ground. It's overlapping everything. Let's say we change this to physics only, no queries, and we hit simulate. Well, you notice the same thing happens, but you'll notice something different. We have no error. The engine doesn't care that you're doing something stupid, that you're telling this physical item to just fall through the world. It doesn't care. All it cares about is you said, okay, let's simulate physics. And let's turn on physics for collision. Once these two match up, then you're not going to get the error. We'll go back to query, and you'll notice I'm going to get the error again. Now, why are we not actually colliding with anything? Well, hopefully you'll understand why not. We've told it not to collide. We've told it to overlap or ignore everything. Let's switch this back to dynamic. Oop, that's overlapping. We don't want that. Block all dynamic and hit play. And you'll notice it now stops. We'll notice now when we start it, it has the physics effect. Gravity's turned on, falls down, and it's going to collide against our floor. Why? Well, again, hopefully you know, our floor is world static. Our box is world dynamic. And if we go to this, it's set to block all dynamic. If we go to here, world dynamic is set to block. So our floor is going to block world dynamic objects. Our box is world dynamic. So there you go. You have blocking from the floor because we have set to world dynamic. If we were to change, let's see, our floor here, set to block all, so we're good. And you'll notice these three things, even though they're all the same actor, they all had different colliding, different collision settings here. Let's go ahead and change our box to block all dynamic. Let's go ahead and change our cube. It's set to a physics actor, physics body. Let's change it to, we'll go with no collision. And then we'll change this one to overlap all. And we'll watch what happens. Okay, and there we go. We saw one blueprint with 3 different physical interactions because of the way we set it up. Our middle item is set to collision, stop hiding from me. Is set to turned on physics, so we're going to get a physics interaction. It's a world dynamic, which means our ground is going to block it. Our left item is set to be a physics body, which our ground will block. However, we've turned it to overlap all. Overlap all turns on collision, and when we run it, we go through the floor. Now, why is that? Let's go ahead and pull this back up. We look through here. We've set this up to overlap all instead of block all, and we run it, and there we go. And you notice it hits the ground. Now our third item here, it's hanging up in the middle air. Why is that? Well, we have this set to no collision. Because it's set to no collision, this down here, our collisions enabled, is going to basically be off. No collision. Oh, darn it. Okay, let's set this to custom. You'll notice one issue here. If we set this to any of these, this is something to keep in mind. If you'll notice here, I set this to no collision, and you can see what it shows down here, blocking everything. I set this to invisible wall, blocking everything. I set this to UI, blocking everything. You'll notice an issue. When you are working inside of a blueprint, inside of individual components, this setting right here, these, will not update properly. So you may be confused. You'll be thinking to yourself, well, okay, here's cube 2. I've set it to overlap all, but it says collision is enabled. Or here, let's go with no collision. Well, collision's enabled. I hit play, and now nothing's happening. You're like, why is nothing happening? I look down here at the cube. I choose cube 2, and I look, and it says, well, it says collision's enabled, and it's set to block, but why is it not doing anything? The collision preset, again, is a set of presets. These down here won't update properly if it's inside of a blueprint. If we go here, you'll notice it changes. We can go to no collision, and we have everything set up funky. We go to block all. We go here, and you'll notice every time we're changing these, we're getting different settings down here. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you're having funny issues with collision, just stop, think about what you're trying to accomplish, and walk through everything from scratch. And don't assume anything you see if you're using a preset. That is one of the most important things I've ran into when using Collision. You're sitting here, you're hitting play. Oh, I didn't want that to fall through. Well, that's not good. Let's go back in there. And let's see. We'll go up to cube 1 and we'll look through here. And we're like, well, wait. Okay, and we'll set it to block all. And wait, now this isn't changing. And what's going on here? Or, okay, it's set to block. But when I hit play, it doesn't get blocked. And then you sit there for an hour, you search Google, and you're like, my physics items are set to block, but it's not being blocked. What's going on here? Check your preset. If you're using a preset, check your preset. Oh, I'm using UI. That's probably not the smartest thing. Let's use block all instead. Actually, no. This is a dynamic item. Block all, dynamic, and we'll hit play, and we get the expected response. So there we go. Back to pointing out the naming convention. That's also something that will trip you up in the beginning. Block all, dynamic. You'd think, depending on your language, it may be, okay, block all means I block all. Block all dynamic means I block all dynamic items. Overlap all dynamic, I overlap all dynamic items. Ignore only, pawn. See, this is where your issue breaks down here. You have all your different settings here. No, the way they've named the defaults is block all is the block all default. Block all dynamic is the same thing as block all, but it's with the dynamic object type. So just keep that in mind. It's really confusing when you're trying to do your basics with Collision. I think this is going to wrap up the basic Collision video. We've covered your basic Collision interactions. We've covered your Collision presets, your object and trace, your custom channels for your presets as well as for individual traces. We've covered some errors that you may encounter. Remember, the engine tries to help you when it can. We've covered some things such as why things are blocked, overlapped, or ignored, what the trace and object channels are, as well as how you determine when things overlap, ignore, or block. Now, I did not cover simulate physics. That is covered in the physics section. All we're doing in this video is covering the basics of Collision. And for the most part, what you need to be concerned about is if you want things to collide, make sure you have matching checkboxes and object types as best as possible. This world dynamic object, I want to be affected by this floor, which is a world static object. So I just make sure that I have world dynamic set to block on my floor. And then my world dynamic cube, I want to make sure it's set to block on the world static. And when I simulate, I would in theory get my desired result, assuming I followed my original recommendation of making sure your presets are set properly. Because as you saw there, even though it wasn't set properly. Even though it showed block, it still wasn't set properly. And we had our issue with this being query only. And just having a whole bunch of fun there. And we're having things not falling, as you can see there. And that's because simulate physics isn't on, we build, and boom, it falls down. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the basic collisions video.